Welcome. I'm Laura Friedman. I was outside, but now I'm inside with you. And I'm the president of the Morningside Heights Historic District Committee. And we're so happy that so many of our friends and neighbors are here this evening. It's been a hard year in many ways, but by showing up and coming together, we now are we're not allowing ourselves to be undone by all that has been thrown at us. And even though we can't meet in the same physical space, at least we can via Zoom. So welcome to our presentation on the second phase of historically districting Morningside Heights. Since its founding in 1996, the MHHDC has been dedicated to advancing a preservation approach that considers all facets of the neighborhood's historic, architectural, and cultural legacy. And just a very quick background. Morningside Heights bears the distinction of having the highest concentration of historic institutions and middle-class apartment buildings of anywhere that were built anywhere in the United States in a relatively short period of time. It's home to monumental places of worship, higher learning and healing, and we have different styles of historic architecture in our mix of domestic residence and institutional buildings, which give us the unique identity that is Morningside Heights. The introduction of the subway into Morningside Heights in 1904, coupled with its magnificent parks and prestigious institutions, led to a frenzy of speculative apartment house construction, attracting middle-class residents who are now able to commute directly to work downtown. So topographically, it's situated on a plateau historically known as Harlem Heights, while geographically it is bound by West 110th Street to the south, West 125th Street to the north, and then two Frederick Law Olmsted designed parks to the east and to the west. Now, we achieved the first phase of a historic district in 2017, and we're now in the process of working on phase two, and that's why we're having this webinar this evening, or this presentation, so that you can see what it is that we're talking about. If you look in the chat, you can gain access to our website. You saw it up before. Its address is historicmorningsideheights.nyc, and you can get lots of wonderful information there. You can see the maps of the current district and the next phase, and you're also going to see them during this presentation.
Next up, Gregory Dietrich is proprietor of Gregory Dietrich Preservation Consulting, where he has completed historic architectural investigations, National Register nominations, historic tax credits and grant applications, preservation planning and policy studies, and cultural resource studies. He has been working in the field of historic preservation for over 20 years and is a graduate of Columbia University's Historic Preservation and Real Estate Development programs. And from his long association with MHHDC, many of you know that Gregory was responsible for the academic research and successful presentation that enabled phase one preservation of Morningside Heights. And in our last webinar, Gregory presented the urgent case for designating McGifford Hall as an historic landmark. So it's with great anticipation and appreciation that we are able to learn about Gregory's work to achieve phase two designation. Gregory?
Thank you very much, Robert. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight about the Morningside Heights Historic District Committee's proposal for a second phase of historic districts, focusing on the neighborhood's residential buildings. As a long-term resident of the Heights, it was gratifying to finally see our efforts to designate a Morningside Heights Historic District come to fruition in 2017. And also encouraging to see the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission expand its original boundaries in unexpected ways. Yet we were also mindful of the fact that there was so much more to consider in terms of this neighborhood's historic resources. So I'm here tonight to introduce you to our proposal for 5 mini districts. But before I do that, I just wanted to briefly touch on the early history of the neighborhood to give you some context. And we're going back to British rule. In 1686, Governor Thomas Dongan granted a patent to the mayor, aldermen, and commonalty of the city of New York for a large triangular parcel extending from roughly West 107th to West 124th Streets between the Hudson River and Harlem, which included what is now Morningside Heights. This tract was purchased by Nicholas and James W. DePeyster in the 1780s, which included Bloomingdale Road, which you can see here, a main thoroughfare. Nicholas DePeyster built his country estate on the ridge overlooking the Hudson around West 114th Street. And to the east, James DePeyster's tract remained largely undeveloped. And this is Nicholas's house here, and then James owned a lot of the property that was to the east here. In 1816, the New York Hospital began acquiring land in central Morningside Heights from James's son, and subsequently opened the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum in 1821 on what is now the main campus of Columbia University. And we all know that is here. Elsewhere, the hospital sold its property south of West 113th Street and east of Amsterdam to the newly formed Leek and Watt Orphan Asylum, which opened in 1843, seen over here. The presence of these two institutions, as well as the unfriendly topography and a lack of public transportation, limited the extent of residential development in Morningside Heights throughout the 19th century. Although the heirs of Nicholas DePeyster had subdivided his property in accordance with the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which was essentially the grid that we know in Manhattan, most of this land was held by investors, and development consisted of a limited number of mansions overlooking the river and a cluster of small wood-frame dwellings on West 110th Street, known as Dixonville, after their builder, William Dixon. And so here we have on Cathedral Parkway, Dixonville, and we can see sort of these scattered mansions very close to the river. In 1865, New York City Park Commissioner William Martin proposed a park and an adjacent road along the Hudson River north of 72nd Street. This was the impetus for Riverside Park, which Frederick Law Olmsted designed between 1873 and 1875, with construction between 1875 and 1880, and of course later improvements occurring during the 1930s. On the east side of the neighborhood, Commissioner Andrew Haswell Green recommended that a park be situated on the undevelopable land located north of West 110th Street, between 9th and 10th Avenues. This would eventually become Morningside Park, which was designed by Olmsted, working with Calvert Vaux, initially in 1873, that was revised in 1887, and constructed between 1883 and 1895. In 1868, Broadway, or the Boulevard, as it was originally known, as we can see here, was introduced between West 59th and West 155th Streets, replacing Bloomingdale Road as the main thoroughfare passing through the neighborhood. However, development still continued to be hampered by its rocky outcroppings and uneven terrain, its distance from Fifth Avenue, which at the time was a hub of commercial and residential activity, the exorbitant prices demanded by real estate speculators, and an overall reluctance from developers to build in a nearly vacant area whose social composition had not yet been established. The introduction of the subway into Morningside Heights in 1904 was largely responsible for the proliferation of speculative multifamily middle-class residential developments that occurred over the next 7 years. By then, the Leek and Watts Orphan Asylum had sold its property to the Episcopal Diocese for the construction of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. To the west of Amsterdam Avenue, real estate investors had already begun a campaign to force the Bloomingdale Asylum to vacate the area, maintaining that its presence depressed land values. In response, the asylum's Board of Governors announced its plan to relocate the asylum from Morningside Heights to White Plains in May of 1888. The following year, the Board of Governors auctioned off 98 lots between Amsterdam Avenue and Broadway and West 112th and 14th Streets. In 1892, Teachers College, Columbia College, and St. Luke's Hospital acquired sizable tracts of land from the Bloomingdale Asylum with the intent of relocating their campuses from Greenwich Village and Midtown to Morningside Heights. This concentrated wave of institutional development during the last decade of the 19th century would encourage other institutions to follow suit in the early 20th century, drawn to an area that still boasted sizable tracts of vacant land for campus development. The beginning of the 1890s witnessed the first examples of row house construction in Morningside Heights. However, unlike the Upper West Side and Harlem, whose residential districts already boasted access to mass transportation and local commerce by the late 19th century, Morningside Heights was in the process of becoming a district of large-scale institutions without basic amenities. As a result, a few of the real estate developers who were early investors in row house construction in the neighborhood went into foreclosure 2 years after construction due to a lack of sales. However, once plans for the subway were made public, investors and developers alike rejected the single-family housing model in favor of acquiring multiple lots to build multifamily dwellings. A speculative row house development defined select blocks within the southern part of the neighborhood. French flats and tenements were being introduced within the northern part during the same period. The Stuyvesant Apartments, designed and constructed between 1869 and 1870, was considered the first middle-class apartment house in New York City and based on a Parisian model. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt and located at 142 East 18th Street, this building featured a total of 16 apartments consisting of 2 units per floor, along with 4 artist studios in the attic story, fully equipped bathrooms in each unit, street-facing parlors, bedrooms, dining rooms, kitchens, and separate entrances for residents and servants. The New York City Department of Buildings classified the Stuyvesant Apartments as both a first-class dwelling and a Parisian dwelling, and this new type of middle-class housing eventually became known as French flats, so as not to be confused with tenements, boarding houses, hotels, and luxury apartment buildings. An early horse-drawn streetcar running up Amsterdam Avenue spurred 2 different types of tenements being constructed in the northern part of the neighborhood by the late 19th and early 20th centuries: old law tenements and new law tenements. Old law tenements had to adhere to the Tenement Reform Act of 1879 and were built on either 25-foot wide or 55-foot wide lots in dumbbell plans that featured narrow window shafts between abutting tenements. The narrower tenements featured a single unit per floor, while the wider tenements featured 2 units per floor, along with shared bathrooms among multiple tenants. New law tenements had to adhere to the Tenement Reform Act of 1901 and were built on 50-foot wide lots in dumbbell plans with interior courtyards and at least 1 bathroom per unit. The most prominent type of multifamily dwelling in the Heights was the apartment house, which was targeted to the middle class. And among apartment houses in the neighborhood, there was a hierarchy commensurate with the streets on which the buildings were located, with the most exclusive buildings located along Riverside Drive for its river views, and Broadway for its easy access to mass transit and stores, and the less exclusive buildings located along Amsterdam Avenue, Morningside Drive, and the cross streets. These latter developments targeted lower and solidly middle-class renters, with the 6-story elevator apartment house quickly becoming the standard housing type in the Heights. On the one hand, satisfying renter demands for light-filled apartments with elevators, and on the other, satisfying developer demands for cheaper construction alternatives, which allowed for only semi-fireproof construction on apartment buildings up to 6 stories. So I just wanted to point out with this old law tenement, really how narrow these indentations are on the sides of the building. And you can see just the very, very limited light. You might have an air shaft that would offer some sort of natural light and air to these kitchen spaces. But generally speaking, these were very dark places, unless you were facing, of course, out to the street or to the rear. And then I just want to also show you that we've got the Ulysses at 428 Riverside Drive, which is one of the in one of the proposed districts that we're looking at. The introduction of the subway into Morningside Heights not only resulted in a variety of speculative multifamily residential development, but also in an architectural cohesion that largely reflected a new vernacular architecture born out of the melding of two popular yet disparate styles, Italian Renaissance Revival and Colonial Revival. Although it's unclear as to the precedent for this melding of styles, national events such as the Centennial Exposition of 1876 in Philadelphia and the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago would have exerted a substantial influence in promoting colonial revival and Renaissance revival architecture to the country at large. Apart from these national architectural showcases, New York City had its own history of design to look to for precedent. By the turn of the 20th century, the stylistic and material hallmarks of federal and Georgian style architecture would be integrated into a period revival style known as colonial revival. So really it's sort of like this fusion of these various styles that are coming together in the modern day, early 20th century colonial revival style. Similarly, the city's Italianate architecture had precedent in the mid-19th century palazzo-style store and loft buildings of Tribeca, as well as the cast iron commercial buildings of Soho and the row houses, townhouses, and mansions found in select neighborhoods of Manhattan and West Brooklyn. Now, the Edward Mooney House is a federal style house located in the Lower East Side, and it bears all the hallmarks, which is the red brick. It's got the keyed, that is keystone and splayed lintels, 6/6 windows, as well as, in this case, we've got a gambrel style roof with the end chimney. And sometimes there's two end chimneys. And then we've also got this pedimented entry portico as well. With respect to the Italianate style, some of you may recognize this building, which is located on the northeast corner of Chambers Street and Broadway, as the current headquarters for the Manhattan Department of Buildings. This has a very long history and really was pioneering as one of the first department stores in the country, but also to have been designed in this Italianate style that later became the rage after its construction. Andrew Dolkart, in his book, Morningside Heights, The History of Its Architecture and Development, suggested that McKim, Mead, and White's Columbia University classroom buildings, with their unorthodox combination of Italian Renaissance and colonial-inspired elements, beginning in the late 19th century, may have in fact influenced a range of residential buildings in the neighborhood. In addition, Lamb and Rich's Millbank Hall, which was constructed between 1896 and 1897 at Barnard College, really does appear as if it could have served as a design template to the many multifamily dwellings that were about to be built in the area. And so just to call out, or I should say reiterate what I was just pointing out, in terms of this Renaissance revival style with the colonial revival motifs, you've got the rusticated base here below, which is essentially the block-like units of the limestone base. You've got the upper stories in this red brick, often laid in what we would call Flemish bond, which is the long side of the brick alternating with the short side of the brick. And often that short side has a burnt header, which is a dark, usually a black coal color, very distinctive. And then the splayed and keyed lintels I was referring to earlier on the Edward Mooney house. So the splayed and keyed lintels are federal revival. The red brick is colonial revival, but and then the coining is Georgian. So all three of those styles fall under the rubric in the early 20th century of colonial revival. And then Renaissance revival would be, as I was talking about, the rusticated base, the molded enfranements around the windows, the pedimented surrounds as well around the windows. These are all hallmarks of the Renaissance and Renaissance Revival styles. So that brings us to our first proposed district, which is the proposed historic district extension to the existing Morningside Heights Historic District, which reflects two successive waves of speculative development, single family and multifamily dwelling construction. This district is roughly bounded by Amsterdam Avenue and Broadway and West 112th and 114th Streets. And what I've done is just sort of give you an inventory here of the original classifications of the buildings in each of these districts, followed by the general years of construction, as well as the peak period of construction as well. It bears noting that once the Bloomingdale Asylum's Board of Governors decided to auction off its land, it was not willing to risk the possibility of letting the market decide what would get built. Instead, it imposed restrictive covenants on the 98 lots that it auctioned off in 1889, so as to ensure that its property values would be maintained, and in doing so, attempt to emulate the success of the Upper West Side's fashionable West End to the south. Thus, the developments on West 112th to 114th Streets between Broadway and Amsterdam Avenue reflect the earliest restrictive covenants in the neighborhood, specifying no noxious uses, such as factories or slaughterhouses, minimum building heights of 4 stories, and materials consisting of brick or stone for walls, and slate, tin, or some other type of fireproof material for roofs. These two blocks boast the highest concentration of row houses in Morningside Heights, when developers sought to replicate the successes of the Upper West Side to the south and Harlem to the northeast. And I just wanted to note that this proposed district also abuts the landmark that Kelly spoke of earlier, Engine Company number 47, which is an individual landmark. This proposed extension features several distinct multifamily dwellings. For example, the Phaeton at 539 West 112th Street was designed by George and Edward Bloom in 1909 and was influenced by contemporary progressive French housing. It was also critically praised by the Architectural Record and the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide for its design and materials. The Blum brothers were known for this attention to detail with respect to the designs, incorporating arts and crafts inspired brick, tile, and metalwork. Other notable buildings include a tenement building known as the Kiltonga, located at 540 West 112th Street, which was designed by Neville and Bagg in 1903 and executed in a restrained yet elegant Renaissance Revival style that also incorporates colonial revival elements. Architect George Miller's 6-story apartment house at 512 West 112th Street dates to 1930, so it's actually considerably late for our neighborhood, and is a distinct example of a neo-Romanesque design building with its use of cream-colored brick and its judicious application of ornamentation. Along West 113th Street, the 8-story Rensselaer apartment building at number 536 was designed by the prolific firm of Neville and Bagg in 1909. It offers one of the best examples of a mid-block apartment building designed in the Beaux-Arts style of anywhere in the Heights, with its gleaming white limestone facade, alternating with full-height copper oriels and a Baroque-inspired base and uppermost story. In addition, many of the row houses in the proposed extension were acquired by Columbia University fraternities and sororities, mostly throughout the 20th century, thereby indelibly linking them to the cultural life of the university. These include Sigma Nu fraternity, founded in 1908 and located at 556 West 113th Street, Kappa Alpha Theta sorority, founded in 1986 and located at 534 West 114th Street, and Alpha Delta Phi Society, founded in 1836 and located at 526 West 114th Street, among many other row houses located on these two cross streets. The proposed Amsterdam Avenue Morningside Drive South Historic District reflects a wide variety of speculative, mostly mid-rise multifamily dwellings. It's roughly bounded by Amsterdam Avenue and Morningside Drive and West 115th and 116th Streets. And there's a real cohesion to this particular proposed district in so much as many of these buildings are the 6-story elevator apartment prototype that I talked about before, as you can see. Sort of a very harmonious streetscape and scale. This proposed district offers an array of mid-rise multifamily dwellings that are designed in the Renaissance Revival style and incorporate colonial revival elements. One of the most distinctive ensembles of early 6-story elevator apartment buildings are Cathedral Court, La Touraine, and Montserrat. All 3 buildings were commissioned by the Paterno brothers and designed by Schwartz and Gross, which, working together and independently, exerted an enormous influence on the architectural character of Morningside Heights. Along West 116th Street, there are a mix of building types that include apartment buildings, French flats, a single-family dwelling, and an institutional residence that originally served as a nurse's dormitory for St. Luke's Hospital. Originally known as Cesarine Hall, nurses spelled backward, it was designed by Neville and Bagg in 1906 and is characterized by an imposing Renaissance Revival design. And I strongly urge you, if you're walking along 116th Street, to really look at this building, which also features original stained glass. But it's quite epic in scale, and also epic in style. The just attention to style on this building is quite wonderful. The 3 buildings that I was talking about on Morningside Drive, Cathedral Court, La Touraine, Montserrat, featured these recessed fire escapes, which at the time were marketed as Parisian balconies. The proposed Amsterdam Avenue Morningside Drive North Historic District reflects a variety of speculative multifamily dwellings that encompass mid and high-rise buildings. This proposed district is roughly bounded by Amsterdam Avenue, West 118th Street, and Morningside Drive. Again, we can see quite a cohesion here among these 6-story, both elevator apartment buildings and tenements. They really feel like they're all of a piece. So this is a district that also offers wonderful examples of this Renaissance Revival style, incorporating colonial revival motifs. In addition, the Edmund Francis at 423 West 120th Street, designed by George F. Pelham in 1912, offers a noteworthy counterpart with its Renaissance Revival design, augmented by imposing medieval-inspired ornamentation. And this is really quite a work as well. It's just, if you get a chance to look at this building, it's on the northwest corner of 120th and Amsterdam Avenue. Just when I say imposing, I don't know even a more dramatic word than that when you look at the ornamentation on this building, and really sort of the creative but very sort of somber way in which it has been applied. Other buildings offer variations on the popular arts and crafts style, such as the secessionist-inspired Palmetto at 100 Morningside Drive, also designed by George F. Pelham and dating to 1909, with its ornate roofline featuring prominent corner pilasters containing bellflowers crowned by orbs and terracotta panels and framing green and white tiles in a checkerboard pattern. Andrew Dolkart is my former professor. I definitely count him as a mentor. And I remember very early on in our studio, he would talk about, when you're walking down the street, the need to really look at a building. And I think so much can be said for that, because buildings really do reveal themselves the more that you look at them and you see things. I'm still seeing things that I pass by buildings every day that I haven't seen before. The proposed Broadway Amsterdam Avenue Historic District reflects a district of predominantly working and middle-class multifamily dwellings, along with a discrete religious complex. It's roughly bounded by Broadway and Amsterdam Avenue and West 121st and 123rd Streets. And of all the proposed district, this one includes the most number of tenement buildings. Among them, it includes 3 5-story mixed-use old law tenement buildings at 1268-1272 Amsterdam Avenue, appended by a 6-story mixed-use old law tenement building occupying a 25-foot wide lot at 1274 Amsterdam Avenue, all designed by John Brandt in 1898. And so these are the old law tenements. And for those of you who know this stretch of the block, you know that before the pandemic, this has been a very vital restaurant row along here. These tenements adhere to the popular Renaissance Revival style of the period, while the remaining new law tenements in the proposed district, which were built several years later and of course complied with the new law, adhere to the greater neighborhood-wide trend of Renaissance Revival design, incorporating colonial revival detailing. The south side of West 122nd Street, between Broadway and Amsterdam, offers one of the most distinctive rows of tenement buildings that include 524-530 West 122nd Street, designed by Bernstein and Bernstein in 1906, who was a prolific designer of tenements, French flats, and apartment buildings on the east and west sides of Manhattan. The earliest residential developments in the proposed Broadway Amsterdam Avenue Historic District are 6 5-story French flats at 520-530 West 123rd Street. These were designed by F.T. Camp in 1896, 4 of which were designed in an unconventional Tudor Revival style, and 2 of which were designed in the Renaissance Revival style. Moreover, both of these rows incorporate Romanesque detailing, albeit in different ways. For example, numbers 520 to 526 feature decorative brickwork that includes diaper patterns and coins lining bays containing angled metal oriels with fleur-de-lis detailing and Roman arches under a matriculated roofline. And this matriculated essentially means scalloped. But this is actually quite decorative and imaginative brickwork that forms part of these French flats. Well, further to the west, you've got numbers 528 to 530, which feature these elegant porticos supported by Doric columns under bowed oriels, accentuated by rough-faced brownstone lintels. Among the many tenements in the area is the wildly creative Bancroft, which was designed by Emery Roth in 1910. Located at 509 West 121st Street, this architectural anomaly was originally built as the Seth Low Apartments, after the president of Columbia and the former mayor of Brooklyn, and features a wildly eclectic secessionist design with a Tuscan-inspired roofline. This is a little-known gem by an architect who has been indelibly associated with no less than 3 iconic apartment houses that have come to define the Central Park West skyline: San Remo, the Beresford, and El Dorado. So that brings us to our last proposed historic district, the Riverside Drive, Claremont Avenue district. It reflects a mix of working and middle-class multifamily dwellings. It's roughly bounded by Riverside Drive and Claremont Avenue, West 122nd Street, and Tiemann Place. Again, we see really a predominant 6-story building here, whether it's the tenement or the 6-story elevator apartment building. And here is the one that I showed you a photo of earlier, the Ulysses, when I was showing you an example of the 6-story elevator apartment building. So this proposed district offers one of the most cohesive, intact rows of new law tenement buildings of anywhere in the Heights. Located at 180-200 Claremont Avenue, this entire block front, comprising 8 tenement buildings, was designed by Neville and Bagg in 1905 and bears all the hallmarks of the neighborhood's juxtaposed Renaissance Revival and Colonial Revival styles. And I've got 2 different views of this block front. So you can notice that we've got these larger end buildings, all designed of a piece with a very harmonious row within the middle of these 6-story buildings. Bears noting that Neville and Bagg, together with George F. Pelham and Schwartz and Gross, were the 3 most prolific architecture firms working in Morningside Heights between the late 19th and early 20th century, with Neville Bagg represented by 37 residential buildings in the proposed historic districts, followed by George F. Pelham with 27, and Schwartz and Gross with 13. As such, these firms exerted an enormous influence over the architectural ambiance that makes the Heights so special. Now, directly across the street, 2 new law tenements at 189-191 Claremont Avenue, designed by Denby and Newt in 1905, create a harmonious counterpoint to Neville and Bagg's block front, executed in the Renaissance Revival style, and incorporating both colonial revival and arts and crafts detailing that include the red brick with the burnt headers laid in Flemish bond, which gives it sort of a, like a confetti appearance, the keyed and displayed lintels, and decorative brickwork that includes prominent square and diamond motifs along the top floor here. The proposed district also features distinct examples of the 6-story elevator apartment house, such as 160 Claremont Avenue, designed by Maximilian Zipkis in 1911, with its eye-filling Art Nouveau-inspired design, incorporating polychromatic terracotta along its roof line. Along Riverside Drive, there is a row of Tudor-inspired buildings, ranging from the high-style Ulysses at number 528, designed by Lafayette Goldstone in 1908, to the more restrained Montebello, designed by George Keister in 1906, who was the architect of the Apollo Theater and others in the theater district. So in conclusion, in accordance with the New York City Landmarks Law, the 5 proposed historic districts are significant in the following areas. For their association with 3 prolific architecture, for their harmonious juxtaposition of a wide variety of housing types, ranging from 4 to 10 stories high, and constructed during a peak period between 1896 and 1912 in a variety of styles. And for their association with 3 prolific architecture firms in Morningside Heights that included Neville and Bagg, George F. Pelham, and Schwartz and Gross, who together exerted an enormous influence on the architectural character of the neighborhood, and for their association with Emery Roth in the proposed Broadway, Amsterdam Avenue, and Riverside Drive, Claremont Avenue historic districts, who is an acknowledged master in the field of architecture, and whose work has been recognized on the Upper East and Upper West sides for his significant contributions to the architecture of the apartment hotel and the apartment building. For their historical association with the development of a middle-class neighborhood that was notable for having the highest density of middle-class housing built anywhere in the city within a limited amount of time. And for the West 113th and 114th Street row houses, historical association with Columbia University's fraternities and sororities, which offered early conversions of these single-family houses into dormitory uses when market forces at the turn of the 20th century made them no longer viable. This is of course, a use that has solidified their long-term association with the cultural life of the university that continues to this day. For their high concentration of vernacular multifamily dwellings, melding two popular yet disparate styles of the early 20th century, Italian Renaissance Revival and Colonial Revival, and in doing so, emulating the architectural precedent set by their institutional counterparts, such as Columbia University and Barnard College. And finally, for their embodiment of a single period of construction of roughly 16 years between 1896 and 1912, resulting in multiple styles such as Beaux-Arts, Arts and Crafts, and Tudor Revival, with the most dominant style reflecting Renaissance Revival with Colonial Revival motifs. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Gregory, for offering us that wonderful overview. To our audience, if you haven't yet, I urge you to go to our MHHDC website. You'll find it in the chat and access Gregory's detailed report loaded with maps and fascinating historical and architectural data. It's superbly presented in making the case for Phase 2 historic preservation of Morningside Heights.
If there's one thing this presentation has showed us tonight, it is to look at buildings, to really look at them, and to look up, because that really struck me as I don't think I've noticed some of the things that Gregory pointed out tonight on some of those buildings that have such beautiful decoration and design at the top of the building. So look up. I want to also say a thank you to the Morningside Heights Historic District Committee's Executive Committee. Been around for a while. We do a lot of hard work together, and they are terrific. So thank you, thank you. Our wonderful panelists, of course. Gregory's been with us since the renewed beginning of the Historic District Committee. He's seen us through everything. He knows so much, and we've learned so much. So thank you, Gregory. To Kelly and to the HDC, but to Kelly personally for that wonderful presentation tonight. Covered so much of the questions that people have. And also to HDC, which has been a guiding force for us through our entire process. And we can't say thank you enough to them. And of course, to everyone who attended. Thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. And we hope to continue to work together to keep this community, our community, Morningside Heights, the beauty that it is. So thank you. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you again soon.